The sport I chose for my physics of sports project is stickball. Stickball is an indigenous sport and it is one of the oldest organized team sports in North America, and it has a massive history in Canada, particularly within the Haudenosaunee community in Ontario and Quebec. Historically, it was called the little brother of war because tribes used it to settle diplomatic and land disputes without actual warfare. Today, it remains a major community event that brings entire villages together. Before a match begins, players gather on the field to pray and participate in sacred ceremonies to clear their minds and connect with their ancestors. The game is played on a field roughly the size of a football field. Team sizes vary heavily. Modern matches feature around 30 players per side, but traditional community games can have over 100 players on the field at once. Defense is incredibly intense and highly physical. There are no protective pads worn, and players can use body checks and physical contact to stop the offense. Because you cannot touch the ball with your hands, players must advance it strictly by running it down the field or passing it through the air. The primary objective centers around the goals. At each end of the field sits a vertical timber pole standing 25 to 30 feet high. Scoring works by striking the opponent's goalpost. Teams earn 1 point by hitting the upper portion of the goalpost with a throw, or by running up and physically touching the pole while maintaining possession. Matches are timed or played until a team hits a set threshold like 2 or 4 points. While male-only games strictly use sticks, women traditionally play using their bare hands to catch and make throws. The traditional equipment involves each player having 2 sticks. These sticks were made out of flexible hickory wood bent at the top into a pocket to scoop the ball and hold the ball. The ball itself was a compact solid sphere that was woven out of leather or cloth strips wrapped around a tight central core. For my calculations and videos, I used a whippet ball, and for my sticks, I made sticks out of wall trim, bendable plastic, wires to make the basket for the ball to sit into, and then zip ties to secure it all together. Let's say Maria uses her stick to launch the ball at an angle, and we want to find its maximum height that it'll reach. Because it's moving at an angle, we only care about its upward motion, and by tracking the vertical changes between 2 quick frames using the Tracker app, I was able to find its initial vertical velocity at 0.616 meters per second. Next, I used the kinematic equation on the screen, and I found that at its peak height, the ball's upward motion stops for a split second, making the final vertical velocity 0. Solving for the distance gained against gravity, the math shows that the ball climbed an extra 0.193 meters. To find the total max height, I added the climb to the initial launch height of 1.42 meters, giving us the total and a maximum height of 1.61 meters reached by the ball on Earth. Let's look at a scenario where me and Elena are both practicing some stickball moves, and our balls accidentally roll off our sticks and across the towards each other. My ball gets a head start of exactly 1 second. 1 second later, Elena's ball starts rolling to catch up. To find the exact point where they intercept, I analyzed their uniform linear motion. By tracking my ball's position over time, I calculated its constant velocity at 0.661 meters per second east, meaning it gained an initial head start displacement of 0.661 meters. Elena's ball rolled faster at a velocity of 0.838 meters per second east. To solve for the time required to close the gap, I set up a relative displacement equation, dividing my ball's head start by the difference between our 2 velocities. This gave me a catch-up time of 3.73 seconds. Finally, I multiplied this time by Elena's velocity, and that proves that her ball successfully intercepts mine at exactly 3.12 meters from the starting point. Maria is an avid stickball player and wants to figure out the ball's velocity relative to her own movement as she runs. To analyze this, I'm starting with a vector addition equation. The velocity of the ball relative to the ground is equal to the velocity of the ball relative to the player plus the velocity of the player relative to the ground. However, because my data and my video only gives me the ball speed relative to the ground and the player speed relative to the ground, I needed to isolate the ball speed relative to the player. By rearranging my initial vector formula, I subtracted the player's velocity from both sides, and this derives our final equation. The velocity of the ball relative to the ground minus the velocity of the player relative to the ground equals the velocity of the ball relative to the player. Plugging in my data, the ball's velocity relative to the ground was 1.5 meters per second east, and the player's velocity is 1.22 meters per second east. Subtracting the player's frame of reference from the ground frame gives me a relative ball-to-player velocity of exactly 0.28 meters per second east. Now let's look at a scenario where Maria throws the ball at the wall at an angle and it bounces right off. To find the overall change in velocity, we have to look down at the initial and final velocity vectors in 2 dimensions. First, I broke down my initial velocity of 3.58 meters per second at east 42 degrees north, and my final rebound velocity of 2.23 meters per second east 30 degrees south into their horizontal and vertical components. Next, because change in velocity is final velocity minus initial velocity, I subtracted my components. The ball's horizontal velocity changed by negative 3.78 meters per second, meaning it lost speed towards the east, while its vertical velocity changed by negative 0.47 meters per second, meaning it shifted downwards. Finally, using Pythagorean theorem, I combined these components to find a total change of velocity of 2.71 meters per second. Using the inverse of tan, I was able to find that the final direction of this vector change is west 7.1 degrees south. The change of velocity of the ball is 2.71 meters per second in the direction of west 7.1 degrees south. Now let's say I'm playing a game of stickball and I am swinging my stickball stick in a horizontal circle to the side before I throw it. To analyze the dynamics of this rotation, I first determine the period, which is 1.56 seconds for a full swing cycle to occur. Using this, I calculated the tangential speed by dividing the circular circumference by the period, giving me 4.23 meters per second. Now I was able to analyze the horizontal forces acting on the ball using my free body diagram. The centripetal acceleration pulling the ball towards the center of the circular path is calculated by squaring the tangential speed and dividing it by the 1.05 meter radius of the swing, giving me 17.03 meters per second squared. Finally, applying Newton's second law, I applied the ball's mass of 0.03 kilograms by this acceleration. This proves that the net centripetal force required to keep the ball moving in that horizontal circle is exactly 0.511 newtons towards the center. Next, let's look at a collision along the floor where I'm practicing stickball and my ball rolls right out of the stick's pocket and crashes directly into a perfectly still ball. To solve for their final motion, I used two principles, the law of conservation of momentum and the law of conservation of kinetic energy. The law of conservation of momentum states the total momentum of a system before a collision must equal the total momentum after. Since the second ball starts completely still, all the starting momentum belongs entirely to my moving ball. Because we are assuming no energy is lost to the surroundings, kinetic energy is also fully conserved, meaning the total energy before the crash equals the total energy after. Since both balls have an identical mass of 0.03 kilograms, the masses completely cancel out in my equations. For the momentum side, this leaves a clean linear equation where my ball's initial speed equals final velocity 1 plus final velocity 2. For the kinetic energy side, I was left with the velocities squared. By substituting my isolated momentum equation into the kinetic energy equation, I created a quadratic formula, and from there I was able to calculate the speed of the stationary ball after the collision, which came out to 0.24 meters per second west. I'm switching up the sport a little bit, and instead of using my regular 0.03 kilogram ball, which I left lying on the floor stationary, I decided to use a heavier ball of 0.041 kilograms. The ball rolls out of my pocket and straight into my stationary normal ball, assuming a perfectly elastic collision. This means that we apply the law of conservation of kinetic energy and the law of momentum. The law of conservation of kinetic energy states that the total kinetic energy of the system before the crash must exactly equal the total kinetic energy after, with absolutely no energy lost to surroundings like heat or sound. Because the incoming ball is heavier, it possesses more inertia. This means it is harder to stop, so it experiences a smaller change in kinetic energy during the impact than a lighter ball would. To solve for this motion, I combined this energy conservation law with my momentum calculations. After substituting the equations to form a quadratic formula, I was able to calculate that after the collision, the lighter stationary ball launches forward at 0.73 meters per second west, while the heavier ball keeps rolling forward behind it at 0.17 meters per second west. I lost my game and I was super mad, so I threw my stickball ball straight up in the air and it completely escaped. In physics, this brings us to a concept of escape speed, which is the absolute minimum speed an object needs to break free from a planet's gravitational pull and never fall back down. To calculate this, I started with the total energy equation, where the initial kinetic and gravitational potential energy equals the final kinetic and gravitational potential energy. Because the ball is escaping to an infinite distance away, it reaches a point where it completely stops and is free from the planet's pull, meaning we can set both the final kinetic energy and final gravitational potential energy to 0. This simplifies the equation down, allowing me to set the initial kinetic energy equal to the negative gravitational potential energy, the initial. Because of how the formula works, the mass of the ball completely cancels out, meaning that escape speed depends strictly on the mass and radius of the planet itself and is not dependent on the mass of the ball. Plugging in Earth's mass and radius, the calculation shows that the escape speed required to throw the ball straight into space from the surface is 1.12 times 10 to the power of 4 meters per second up. Unfortunately, my ball completely escaped my throw, but instead of flying off into deep space, it got caught and is now orbiting Earth at a height of 4.0 times 10 to the power of 5 meters. I want to figure out what speed it is traveling at to stay in Earth's orbit. To find this orbital speed, we look at the balance of forces. The centripetal force keeping the ball moving in a circle is completely provided by Earth's gravitational force, so they're equal. Setting them equal to each other, and you'll see that the mass of my ball cancels out completely, leaving a formula that only depends on the mass of the planet and the total distance from its center. By adding the height of the orbit to the radius of the Earth, we get our total radius. Plugging everything into the orbital velocity calculation shows that the ball is orbiting at a speed of 7.67 times 10 to the power of 3 meters per second, pointing perpendicular to the pole of gravity. Now, let's look at how much speed is needed just to get the ball to a specific height before it even starts orbiting. For this calculation, I want to see what it would take to throw the ball from Earth's surface up to an altitude of 1.0 times 10 to the power of 5 meters. To find this launch speed, I used the law of conservation of energy. I started with the equation initial kinetic energy plus initial gravitational potential energy equals final kinetic energy plus final gravitational potential energy. Since the ball momentarily stops climbing at its peak before gravity can pull it back down, the final kinetic energy becomes 0. This lets us rearrange the formula to show that the initial kinetic energy is equal to the final gravitational potential energy minus the initial gravitational potential energy. By adding the peak height to Earth's surface, we get a total radius of 6.48 times 10 to the power of 6 meters. Isolating the initial velocity and plugging in our values, the calculation shows that the ball needs an initial launch speed of 1.39 times 10 to the power of 3 meters per second.